Hey guys, Vlad here with AVT-Astro. So I'm sure like most of you, unfortunately with the pandemic wearing on and on and on, I haven't been able to see much of my Astro friends lately. The other day though, I finally did get to see one of my good buddies, Bavesh. He actually owns two UPS stores here in the area, and we kind of got into an interesting discussion regarding Aperture and kind of how much is enough. So if you're wondering, what I was doing at the UPS store, he actually kind of runs a separate business to where he does astro prints. So I've got a couple of examples of the work that he's done. Let's check it out. All right, so this is M81 and M82. This is a picture that I took, I believe this was taken in Cottonwood Canyon, about 16 hours worth of total exposure. This was done with an 80 millimeter APO with my Lomo 80 millimeter that I had at the time. This was taken about a year ago. This is one of my best pictures. Unfortunately, here on camera, the galaxies are looking kind of overexposed. Bavesh printed these for me on, I think it's called like metallic paper or something like that. I mean, the contrast on this paper is just totally crazy, out of this world. I mean, it almost looks like you're looking at a computer monitor or something like that. This is NGC 7000, one of my favorite wide field deep sky objects. I love observing this visually with short focal length APO, so yeah. Pretty cool prints. I think these are like 22 by 27 or something like that. But yeah, this paper is amazing. Really, really good quality. I'm really pleased with how these turn out. And I'm not like some kind of super duper astrophotographer, so do keep that in mind. So I'm pretty sure that with better image files, you probably get better results. Okay, yeah. So this angle is kind of showing up the galaxies a little bit better. Not as overexposed. Alright, so kind of getting back to the discussion of Aperture. So the way that we kind of, got into that discussion is Bavesh actually, besides doing the astro prints, recently published his own book. That's called, let's take a look at his website. It's called A Comprehensive Field Guide to the NGC Objects. Basically, the book has, it's like a pictorial guide. It's got pictures of all, I think there's almost 8,000 NGC objects. And even though he's got a pretty big scope, he's already got a 15-inch Obsession Ultra Compact, he's finding that, some of these like fainter dim fuzzies, they're requiring an even bigger scope. So he's only been in the hobby for, I think, around 4 years, and he started with the gray scope. He dove in pretty deep into the hobby initially. He's thinking of doing an even deeper dive and getting a scope that's like in the 25-inch range. So that kind of, got me thinking that, maybe more people are kind of interested in this topic of, how much aperture is really enough for, whether you're doing visual observing or if you're doing astrophotography. So anyhow, yeah, let's get down into the astro cave and kind of talk about it a little bit more. See you guys there. Alright, now I know what you're thinking. You're like, Vlad, you clearly do not have enough telescopes. I know, I'm working on solving that problem. Anyhow, let's get into the topic. Okay, so how big of a telescope do you really need? Well, I mean, that's kind of a opening can of worms type of question. I think it really depends on what you're trying to observe. Or if you're doing astrophotography, it depends on what type of objects you're most interested in photographing. So what do I mean by that? Well, so if you live in most parts of the world, and you do, unless you're an alien and you're watching this, the scene, if you're interested in the planetary observing, the scene is only so good on a particular night, and for most of us, the telescope size that you need to kind of maximize the amount of detail you'll get out of the planets will actually be fairly modest. So you actually need a pretty good high quality telescope, but not necessarily like a really big one. So, since I touched on planetary stuff, I guess let's start with that. From my experience personally, I mean here, obviously I've got several aperture scopes around me. This is just my current scopes. I've actually owned scopes in apertures that basically start from 2 inches and go to 18 inches. I think out of all of those, the only apertures in that range from 2 inches to 18 inches that I have not owned is a 13-inch telescope, a 15-inch telescope, and a 17-inch telescope. Otherwise, I've had them in every single aperture, like number. I mean, even just the scopes that I have here, I've got a 3-inch scope here, I've got a 4-inch Takahashi there, I've got my 5-inch Mac here that's kind of hiding out, I've got a 6-inch SCT here, the 6SE, I've got an 8-inch SCT here. Not in frame, but I've got my 170-80D out there on the shelf, so that's a 7-inch scope. In my observatory, I have a 12-inch scope that's obviously not here, and then I've got my 16-inch binoscope there. So even now, I mean, I've got a pretty wide range of apertures. So for planetary type of stuff, again, we're going to start with that. On most nights I've seen, really, I would say that even a good 5-inch scope, whether it's like a little Mac like this guy, or a good APO, will probably show you about as much as there is to see on the average night I've seen. I live here in the Northwest, and honestly, I'd be pretty hard pressed to have too many nights to where a larger scope than a 5-inch will show me more detail. Now, just to kind of cover my bases, I think if you live in an area of better seeing, or you're one of those guys that's really into planetary type of stuff, I think having a scope even up to 10 inches is pretty beneficial, for those rare nights of good seeing. Beyond that, I mean, honestly, pretty hard pressed to say that you'll have very many nights to where a scope larger than a 10-inch will show you more detail. But honestly, if I was a planetary guy and I lived in, like kind of like where I live now in the Northwest, yeah, I mean, I'd be pretty happy with the 5-inch. So there isn't very many nights to where I feel like I need more than a 5-inch scope to kind of maximize the scene. Like on most nights, I don't really use over 200x. So if you find that you use over 200x a lot wherever you live, then you might benefit from a larger scope. Alright, so now kind of getting more into deep sky, and this is where it kind of becomes interesting, especially for visual use, but also for astrophotography, which we'll touch on in a minute. So how big of a scope do you need for deep sky observing? Well, the true answer is that, there isn't a scope that's too big, as far as seeing more detail is concerned for deep sky type of objects. I mean, obviously, we're all constrained by, how big of a scope we could, both store in our house or transport or can afford, So, we'll kind of talk about scopes that are reasonably accessible to amateurs, but we'll even kind of, touch into the larger apertures that are still accessible to amateurs, but, probably, most people can't afford or transport or wherever. Okay. So, I will at this point kind of bring in the little slide that I made with light grasp of scopes. So in general, a good rule of thumb that a lot of people kind of go by is that if you have a telescope, like let's say right now you currently have a 5-inch scope, the thing that'll give you a good increase in deep sky performance is doubling the light grasp of the scope. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to double the aperture, although that wouldn't be bad either. But in general, the formula for light grasp is on the little slide. You can look it up. I've got all the apertures listed to probably any scope that any reasonable person is going to, be able to afford or transport or whatever listed on the slide anyhow. So it's already all calculated for you. So as you can see, if we start with the scope, that's really small, like 2-inch or 3-inch scope. Pretty much going up any inch increments from that, so going from like 2-inch to 3-inch increment. The highlighted light grasp figures, I have them highlighted to where it doubles roughly the light grasp of the telescope. So the first three, going from 2-inch to 3-inch or 3-inch to 4-inch, you're actually doubling the light grasp every single time. So those steps are actually significant. And then, as you notice, we actually take our first kind of like skip in aperture from 4-inch to 6-inch. And then from that, it kind of goes on. So from a 6-inch, you need about a 9-inch scope, and then a 13 and 18. And then we start to take really big jumps. So from an 18-inch scope, you'd actually need to go to a 26-inch scope. And from a 26-inch, you'd need to go all the way to a 36-inch scope. So anyhow, this is just in general a good kind of rule of thumb for determining, like if you already have a scope and you're thinking about, getting a bigger one, like, well, how much bigger, do you need? Now, that's just kind of like all theory and good, and, from personal experience, it's actually pretty true. Overall, though, I'm kind of a deep sky junkie. I love deep sky visual observing. So, just from my experience, like, how big of a scope do I feel like I need to do deep sky observing? It kind of depends a little bit, like on the type of objects that you're observing. So a lot of nights, actually, some of the best memories that I have of deep sky observing is actually with the TeleVue 85 with one of these guys. I actually used to own one of these like 20 years ago. That was the Evergreen, just like this one. I recently picked this thing up, so it's kind of brought back a lot of memories for me. But some of the, like most memorable objects that I've observed is, like really big objects like the North American Nebula, with actually this scope and an O3 filter, back ages ago. So, if you're into kind of observing large objects and you have access to a dark sky, you really don't need that big of a telescope necessarily. Like this, again, has provided me with some really memorable views. Right now I've got the FSQ 106, that's also a really good, wide field type scope. So awesome for those really big objects. If you're kind of more into observing smaller objects, globular clusters, planetary nebula, especially galaxies, that's when those really kind of, going up in aperture is really going to be beneficial for you. So when I was kind of, starting out in astronomy, I kind of went through a range of SCTs. So I started with an 8-inch, and then I went up to a 10-inch, and then I went up to a 12-inch. Actually, pretty much in the LX200 line. And that's when I first kind of experienced those kind of incremental differences in light grasp. Overall, I would say that if you're really kind of into deep sky observing, I would say a good minimum aperture for a one-scope setup is an 8-inch SCT, so something along the lines of one of these guys. And there's kind of a good reason that both me and Celestron have sold like gazillions of 8-inch SCTs, because they're still fairly compact, fairly easy to pack around, but they do give you a good light grasp. Or of course you could do a Dob. If you're really crazy and you're a millionaire, you could do an 8-inch refractor, but that's kind of a whole different beast. So from that, let's say you currently already have an 8-inch scope, or you're maybe you have like a 5 or a 6-inch and you want to take that next bump up. I would say that a really good aperture, just in general, without getting into the really big scopes, is around 12 inches. With the 12-inch scope, that's like that first size scope to where I feel like whether I'm looking at dim galaxies, small planetary nebulas, like whatever fits in the field of view of that scope. That's the first aperture I would say to where it feels like, I'm already using a big scope that's showing me most of what can be seen. So, I mean, take that for what it is. I've used quite a bit of scopes in that aperture range, and 12 inch is the first size that I've considered to be like a really good deep sky type of scope. Now, let's say that you already have a 12-inch scope, or maybe, let's say you have a 10-inch, and you kind of looked at the chart, and you're like, okay, well, going up to the 12 inch isn't really worth it for me. What's the size I would recommend just in general for like a bigger scope? You're probably, once you get past that 12-inch size, you're probably dealing with the DOP is what you're dealing with, at that point. I mean, there's a few SCTs that are that big, but they're really observatory class instruments past like 12 inches. I would say I would recommend a 16-inch scope, so that'd be like one of these guys. Obviously, this is a bino scope, so there's two 16-inch scopes there. But in 16 inches, you get a really good aperture size to where if you take that sucker out to a dark sky, I mean, you start to feel like you're not really limited by the scope per se. I mean, you could see pretty much most objects, in the NGC catalog. Now, as I've, kind of touched on earlier, there is a certain point to where, you might even feel like you need more than that. Like my friend Bhavesh, he's kind of thinking of a bigger scope. But for most type of observing though, a 16-inch is kind of like that level to where you kind of start to feel like you're not really limited by the scope. I mean, you feel like you could point the thing at anything and see, a good amount of detail. Now, the other reason that I recommend it is because, as I said, I actually have had an 18-inch scope, and going beyond the 16-inch, you're really kind of, the complexity of transporting the thing and setting it up and everything just increases kind of exponentially. So a 16-inch scope, I could break it down, not this one, not the binoscope, but just a single 16-inch scope. I could break it down and put it in the back of a Honda Civic. I used to do that all the time, with the neat light bridge. And then I had a more premium 16-inch scope, it easily breaks down, throw it in the back of a Civic, and you're good to go. With an 18-inch, I already had to get a little trailer for my truck. It's just a lot, harder to load it up, to transport and that type of deal, and to set it up. And obviously, if you get even bigger than that, then it just becomes even harder. So that's why 16-inch overall, it's a good aperture, shows you a lot of detail on deep sky objects, but it's still really easily transportable, and I feel like most people can, set it up and transport it by themselves. So that's really nice. Okay, so now getting to astrophotography. So how big of a scope or how small of a scope or whatever should you have for astrophotography? I'll start off by saying I'm not like a super astrophotography whiz, but I do know the basics. Just in general, for astrophotography, it really comes down to the object you're trying to be after, essentially. If you're after those huge planetary or huge just nebula and stuff like that, small aperture APOs, which you're after, so like an 80 millimeters, like what most people use, really good. Something like the FSQ 106. I'm kind of still newer to astrophotography, so I'm kind of taking it easy in the sense for actual astrophotography. Now, I also do EAA, which is similar. It's where you use a camera to stack a bunch of shorter exposures to to see a life basically view of objects, deep sky objects. And for that, something like the FSQ 106, I do use it for EAA sometimes, but the amount of objects that you could see in a lot of detail with the short focal length refractor is actually pretty limited. So I actually have my 12-inch SCT that I have in my observatory. That's a really good EAA scope because, whether I'm going after the small little planetary nebula, small galaxies, globular clusters, just gives you a lot more image scale. So to kind of sum it up, For astrophotography, think of the scope size, whatever the aperture is. You really kind of have to look at it from the perspective of just the focal length type of difference, essentially. So if you're, it just kind of, I guess, comes down to kind of sum it up. Just look at what's going to be a good focal length that'll frame the object that you're after. So if you're, again, after bigger stuff, you probably want a short focal length refractor. If you're after like really small little planetary nebulas, that's where like a larger scope will be kind of beneficial, I guess, for you. Or if you're like into planetary imaging, you obviously need a longer focal length, so that's going to be really beneficial for you. So anyhow, hopefully you guys found that kind of helpful. Hopefully that kind of steers you in the right direction as far as maybe how big of an aperture you should be after for either visual observing or for astrophotography. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, comments, leave them in the thing below. If you're not subscribed, please do consider subscribing, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.